At a corner booth, half hidden by the shadow of a faded curtain, sat Walter Hensley. His hands, knotted with age and years of labor, rested on the table, one finger tracing the edge of a chipped coffee mug. His jacket, a faded olive drab that might once have been an army surplus, hung loosely on his thin frame. A small pin, a bronze star, barely noticeable, glinted on the lapel, catching the light when he shifted. His eyes, a pale blue that seemed to hold too many winters, stared out the window at the flagpole across the street. The flag's sharp cracks in the wind seemed to pull at something deep within him, something he hadn't spoken of in years. Walter was a regular at Rosie's, though few noticed him beyond a polite nod. He came every morning at 6:45, ordered black coffee and a single slice of wheat toast, and left a $2 tip no matter the bill. The waitresses, kind but busy, knew him as the Quiet Vet, a nickname whispered behind the counter. They didn't know much else, only that he'd served somewhere, sometime, and that he always carried a small, leather-bound notebook, its pages yellowed and edges frayed. Sometimes he'd jot something down, his pen moving slowly, deliberately, as if each word carried weight. Most days, he just sat, sipped, and watched the world move on without him. This morning, though, was different. The diner was busier than usual, buzzing with anticipation for the town's annual Veterans Day event at the community center down the street. A banner outside read, "Honoring Our Heroes, Willow Creek Remembers," with a schedule of speeches, a color guard, and a keynote by a retired Marine colonel. The event was a big deal in Willow Creek, a town that prided itself on its patriotism, even if the turnout was mostly older folks and a few school kids bussed in for extra credit. Walter had never attended, though he'd walked past the center every year, his steps slowing as he glanced at the flags lining the lawn. "Excuse me, sir? You done with that?" A young waitress, new to Rosie's, hovered by Walter's table, gesturing at his half-empty mug. Her name tag read Kayla, and her smile was practiced but distracted. She was maybe 19, with a ponytail that swung as she moved, her eyes already darting to the next table. Walter nodded, sliding the mug toward her. "All yours," he said, his voice low, gravelly, like stones shifting in a dry riverbed. He reached for his notebook, flipping it open to a blank page, but didn't write. Instead, he glanced at the counter, where a group of men in crisp VFW hats laughed loudly, their voices carrying stories of deployments and old comrades. Walter's lips twitched, not quite a smile, and he turned back to the window. Kayla hesitated, then leaned in slightly. "You going to the thing today, at the community center?" Her tone was polite, but it carried the weight of small-town expectation. Everyone was supposed to show up, clap, and feel good about the flag. Walter's eyes flickered to her, then back to the flag outside. "Not my scene," he said simply, his fingers brushing the bronze star pin. The gesture was unconscious, but it drew Kayla's eye for a moment. She opened her mouth, maybe to ask something, but a shout from the kitchen pulled her away. Walter watched her go, then jotted a single word in his notebook: duty. The morning wore on, and the diner emptied as folks drifted toward the community center. Walter stayed, his toast untouched, his coffee long gone cold. He didn't mind the quiet, it suited him. At 78, he'd learned to carry his past like a rucksack, heavy but familiar. He'd been a young private in Vietnam, 1967, part of the 101st Airborne. He'd jumped into jungles where the air was thick with humidity and fear, carried wounded buddies through mud, and earned that bronze star for dragging a sergeant to safety under fire. He didn't talk about it, not because it hurt, but because words never seemed to fit. The world had moved on. New wars, new heroes, new ways of forgetting. The bell above the diner door jingled, and a group of teenagers shuffled in, their voices loud and careless. They wore hoodies and jeans, one sporting a high school letterman jacket with a football patch. They slid into a booth near Walter's, their laughter cutting through the diner's hum. One of them, a lanky boy with a buzz cut, was talking about the Veterans Day event. "It's just old guys telling war stories," he said, tossing a sugar packet at his friend. "My dad says it's a waste of time unless you're like a general or something." Walter's hand paused on his notebook. He didn't look up, but his jaw tightened, just enough to notice. The boy's words weren't cruel, just thoughtless, the kind of thing kids say when they don't know better. But they landed like a stone in still water, rippling through Walter's thoughts. He remembered a night in '68, a firebase under siege, the sky lit red with tracer rounds. He'd been 19, same as these kids, and he'd prayed to see morning. He had, but not everyone did. The bell jingled again, and a man in a sharp Navy uniform stepped inside. He was young, maybe 30, with the polished look of an officer. Lieutenant's bars on his shoulders, ribbons neatly aligned on his chest. The diner hushed for a moment, heads turning. The officer scanned the room, then strode toward the counter, where Rosie herself, a stout woman with gray curls, was wiping down mugs. "Morning, ma'am," the officer said, his voice clear and formal. "I'm Lieutenant Daniel Carter, here for the Veterans Day event. I was told I could pick up some programs here for the ceremony." Rosie beamed, handing him a stack of folded papers. "You're early, Lieutenant. Want some coffee before you head over?" Carter glanced at his watch, then nodded. "Appreciate it. Black, please." He took a seat at the counter, a few stools down from the VFW group, who immediately leaned in to shake his hand and swap stories. Walter watched from his booth, his expression unreadable. The officer's presence seemed to shift the air, like a new current moving through the room. The teenagers, though, didn't notice. Their chatter grew louder, one of them mimicking a salute with exaggerated flair. "Yes, sir, General, sir," he said, laughing. His friends joined in, tossing mock salutes across the table. Kayla, passing by with a tray, shot them a look but said nothing. Walter's pen scratched another word in his notebook. Respect. Then it happened. The lanky boy, still chuckling, stood to grab a menu from the counter. He didn't see Walter, didn't notice the old man easing out of his booth to head for the door. Their shoulders collided, not hard, but enough to make Walter stumble slightly, his notebook slipping from his hand. It hit the floor with a soft thud, pages splaying open. "Whoa, sorry, Grandpa," the boy said, half laughing, bending to grab the notebook. He glanced at it, then at Walter, his grin fading as he saw the old man's face. "Didn't see you there." Walter steadied himself, his hand gripping the edge of a table. "It's fine," he said, his voice steady but quiet, like he was used to being unseen. He held out his hand for the notebook, but the boy hesitated, his eyes catching something on the open page. A faded sketch of a helicopter, a date scrawled beneath it. Quezon, '68. "What's this?" the boy asked, curiosity flickering in his voice. Before Walter could answer, one of the boy's friends called out, "Come on, Jake, leave the old guy alone. We're going to be late." Jake handed the notebook back, but his eyes lingered on Walter's jacket, on the bronze star pin. "You were in a war or something?" he asked, not mocking now, just unsure. Walter tucked the notebook under his arm. "Something like that," he said, turning toward the door. The bell jingled as he stepped outside, the cold air hitting his face, like a memory of mornings in the jungle, when the dawn was the only promise you had. Inside, Lieutenant Carter had watched the exchange. His coffee sat untouched, steam curling upward. He slid off his stool, programs in hand, and followed Walter out the door. The teenagers went back to their laughter, but Kayla, wiping down a table, caught Carter's eye as he passed. She saw something in his expression, focus, maybe, or recognition, and paused. Outside, Walter stood by the flagpole, his breath visible in the crisp air. The flag snapped above him, its rhythm steady like a heartbeat. He didn't hear Carter approach until the lieutenant spoke. "Sir," Carter said, his voice firm but respectful, "I couldn't help but overhear. Were you at Quezon?" Walter turned, surprised, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "A long time ago." Carter nodded, his gaze steady. "My grandfather was there, 101st Airborne. He talked about it some before he passed. Said it was hell, but the men he served with, they were the best part of it." Walter's grip on his notebook tightened. He didn't speak, but his eyes held Carter's, searching for something. A flicker of memory crossed his face. A muddy hill, the roar of artillery, a friend's hand gripping his as they waited for evac. He pushed it down, like always. "I'm heading to the ceremony," Carter said, gesturing toward the community center. "Would you join me? I'd be honored to walk with you." Walter shook his head almost reflexively. "Appreciate it, Lieutenant, but I don't do crowds." He paused, then added, "Got my own way of remembering." Carter didn't push. Instead, he straightened, his posture snapping into something formal, deliberate. He raised his hand in a crisp salute, holding it for a long moment. "Thank you, sir," he said, his voice carrying across the quiet street. "For what you did." Walter froze. The salute wasn't showy, wasn't for anyone else. It was just for him. He felt the weight of it, like a hand on his shoulder after years of carrying that rucksack alone. His throat tightened, but he managed a nod, his own hand twitching as if to return the gesture. He didn't. Instead, he turned back to the flag, his eyes tracing its stars. Carter lowered his hand and smiled, a small, genuine thing. "If you change your mind, sir, there's a seat for you." He turned and headed toward the community center, his steps measured, the programs tucked under his arm. Walter stood there a while, the flag's rhythm filling the silence. He opened his notebook, flipping to the page with the helicopter sketch. Beneath it, he wrote another word: scene. Inside the diner, Kayla watched through the window, her hands still on the rag she'd been using to wipe tables. She didn't know Walter's story, not really, but she'd seen the way his shoulders had straightened, just a fraction after Carter's salute. She glanced at the teenagers, still laughing, and wondered if they'd noticed. Probably not, but she had. The Veterans Day event was starting soon, and the street was filling with people. Families, veterans, kids waving small flags. Walter didn't move toward the community center. He didn't need to. For the first time in years, someone had seen him, really seen him, and that was enough. He tucked his notebook into his jacket next to the bronze star pin and started walking home, the flag's snap echoing behind him. Back in the diner, Kayla picked up Walter's mug, noticing the $2 tip he'd left, as always. She slipped it into her apron, then paused, her eyes catching the notebook's faint outline in her memory. She didn't know why, but she felt like she'd witnessed something important, something worth remembering. The story of Walter Hensley wasn't over, not yet. What small act of kindness can you offer today to someone who feels unseen? Subscribe to Hoffman's stories for more tales of quiet heroism and the power of compassion. Walter Hensley walked slowly along the sidewalk, his boots scuffing the cracked pavement. He hadn't planned to come this close to the community center, but his usual route home took him past it, and something, maybe the flag's sharp cracks or the echo of Lieutenant Carter's salute, had slowed his steps. His olive drab jacket hung loose, the bronze star pin catching the late morning light. In his hand, he clutched his leather-bound notebook, its weight familiar, like an old friend. He didn't look at the crowd, but he felt their presence, a tide of voices that stirred memories he usually kept buried. Inside the community center, Lieutenant Daniel Carter stood near the stage, adjusting his uniform's cuffs. The programs he'd picked up from Rosie's were stacked neatly on a table, their covers bearing a black and white photo of a World War II soldier saluting. Carter's eyes scanned the room, but his thoughts were still outside, with the old man by the flagpole. Ki-san. The name had stuck with him, a fragment from his grandfather's stories, mud, mortars, and men who held the line when hope was thin. He wondered about Walter's story, the weight behind that bronze star, and why he'd chosen to stay away from a day meant to honor him. Outside, Walter paused across the street, half hidden by a gnarled oak. He could hear the band strike up the Star-Spangled Banner, the notes uneven but heartfelt. A few veterans stood, hands over hearts, while others saluted, their movements stiff with age. Walter's hand twitched, as if to join them, but he didn't. Instead, he opened his notebook, flipping to the page with the helicopter sketch. Below it, the word "scene" stared back at him, written in his careful, slanted hand. He traced it with a finger, then closed the book. Back at Rosie's, Kayla was finishing her shift, her apron pocket heavy with tips. The diner was nearly empty now, the morning rush long gone. She kept thinking about Walter, about the way his shoulders had straightened after Carter's salute. She didn't know his story, but she'd seen enough regulars to recognize the quiet ones, the ones who carried more than they let on. As she wiped down the counter, she noticed a small, folded piece of paper under Walter's usual booth. Curious, she knelt to pick it up. It was a photograph, creased and faded, showing a young soldier in a jungle, his helmet tilted back, a cigarette dangling from his lips. Behind him, a helicopter's blades blurred against a gray sky. On the back, in faint ink, Keisan, February 1968. Me and Tommy. Kayla's breath caught. She glanced out the window, but Walter was long gone. She tucked the photo into her apron, unsure what to do with it, but certain it mattered. The diner's bell jingled, and Jake, the lanky teenager from earlier, poked his head in. "Hey, Kayla, you coming to the ceremony? My mom's making me go." His tone was half grumbling, but his eyes were softer than before, like he was still thinking about the old man he'd bumped into. "Maybe," Kayla said, her fingers brushing the photo in her pocket. "You see that guy earlier, the one with the notebook?" Jake shrugged. "Yeah, the vet guy, right? Looked like he didn't want to be bothered." Kayla hesitated, then pulled out the photo, holding it up. This was his. I think he dropped it. Jake leaned closer, squinting at the young soldier's face. "Whoa, that's him? He looks tough." He paused, then added, "My grandpa was in Vietnam. Never talks about it, though." Kayla nodded, slipping the photo back into her pocket. "Maybe we should get this back to him." At the community center, the ceremony was in full swing. The high school band had moved on to America the Beautiful, and a local councilwoman was at the podium, reading names of Willow Creek veterans who'd passed in the last year. Carter stood to the side, his posture crisp, but his eyes kept drifting to the crowd, searching. He wasn't sure why he felt compelled to look for Walter, but something about the old man's quiet dignity had lodged in his mind, like a splinter of truth he couldn't ignore. Then he saw him, across the street under the oak, half hidden but unmistakable. Carter excused himself from the stage, weaving through the crowd. A few veterans nodded as he passed, their VFW hats tilted in respect. He stepped onto the sidewalk, the cold air biting through his uniform, and crossed the street. "Sir," Carter called softly, not wanting to startle him. Walter turned, his eyes narrowing, then softening as he recognized the lieutenant. "Didn't expect to see you here?" Walter shrugged, his notebook tucked under his arm. "Just passing by," he said, his voice low, like he was guarding something. "You don't need to keep checking on me, Lieutenant." Carter smiled, a small, genuine thing. "Not checking, sir. Just thought you might like to know. They're dedicating a new plaque today. For Vietnam vets. Thought you might want to see it." Walter's gaze flickered to the community center, where the crowd was settling into their chairs. "I'm not much for plaques," he said, but there was a crack in his voice, a hesitation that hadn't been there before. Carter nodded, undeterred. "Fair enough. But I'd like to tell you about it if you'll humor me." He gestured to a bench nearby, its paint chipped but sturdy. Walter hesitated, then sat, his movements slow, deliberate. Carter joined him, setting the programs on the bench between them. "It's not just a plaque," Carter said, his voice steady. "It's a promise. To remember the ones who came home and the ones who didn't. My grandfather, he was at Keisan too. Never got over it, but he said the men he served with, they were his brothers. I think he'd want you to know your names on that plaque too, if you want it to be." Walter's hand tightened on his notebook. "I didn't do anything special," he said almost to himself. "Just did my job. Got out. Came home." Carter leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "With respect, sir, surviving Keisan wasn't just a job. My grandfather told me about the mud, the mortars, the waiting. Said it was the men who held each other up that made it bearable. You were one of them." Walter didn't respond, but his eyes drifted to the flagpole, where the flag still snapped in the wind. He remembered Tommy, the soldier in the photo, his laugh cutting through the jungle's weight. Tommy hadn't made it home. Walter had carried his dog tags back, handed them to a chaplain, and never spoken of it again. The Bronze Star was for saving a sergeant, but the real weight was Tommy, the one he couldn't save. Across the street, the ceremony paused as the retired Marine colonel, a broad-shouldered man with a voice like gravel, took the stage. "Today," he boomed, "we honor those who served in silence, who carried the weight of wars we can't fully understand. We dedicate this plaque to our Vietnam veterans, whose courage was often met with indifference when they returned. Not today." The crowd stirred, a ripple of applause spreading. Carter glanced at Walter, who was listening now, his face unreadable. "They're talking about you, sir," Carter said quietly, "whether you're up there or not." Walter's throat worked, but he didn't speak. He opened his notebook, flipping to a page with a single sentence. Tommy deserved better. He stared at it, then closed the book again. Back at Rosie's, Kayla and Jake had made a decision. Kayla grabbed her coat, the photo still in her apron pocket, and told Rosie she'd be back after the ceremony. Jake, still grumbling but curious, followed her down Main Street. "You sure he's at the community center?" Jake asked, kicking a pebble as they walked. "He's not," Kayla said, her eyes scanning the street. "But I bet he's close. He's always watching that flag." They spotted him under the oak, sitting with Carter. Kayla hesitated, then crossed the street, Jake trailing behind. "Mr. Hensley?" she called, her voice tentative. Walter looked up, surprised, his hand tightening on his notebook. "Kayla," he said, nodding. "What are you doing here?" She pulled the photo from her pocket, holding it out. "You dropped this?" "At the diner. I thought you'd want it back." Walter took the photo, his fingers brushing the creased edges. His eyes lingered on the young soldier, himself a lifetime ago, and the helicopter behind him. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He glanced at Jake, who was shifting awkwardly, then back at Kayla. "Didn't mean to leave it behind." Jake cleared his throat. "That's you, right? In the picture." He paused, then added, "My grandpa was in Vietnam. Said it was rough. I'm sorry about earlier. Bumping into you." Walter's eyes softened just a fraction. "No harm done," he said, tucking the photo into his notebook. "You didn't know." Carter, watching the exchange, stood. "Mr. Hensley, the ceremony's about to unveil the plaque. I'd like you to come with me. Not for the crowd, but for the men you served with." For Tommy, Walter froze, the name hitting like a punch. He hadn't spoken it aloud in years. He looked at Carter, then at Kayla and Jake, their faces open, waiting. Something shifted in him, a crack in the wall he'd built around his past. He stood slowly, his hand brushing the bronze star pin. "All right," he said finally. "For Tommy." The four of them crossed the street, Walter's steps steady but heavy, like he was marching into memory. The crowd parted slightly as they approached, a few heads turning. The colonel was still speaking, his voice carrying over the lawn. "We owe these men more than we can repay," he said. "But today, we start." Carter guided Walter to a seat near the front, where the plaque waited, covered by a cloth. Kayla and Jake sat behind him, the photo now a quiet bridge between them. As the colonel unveiled the plaque, a simple bronze slab with the words, "To our Vietnam veterans. Your courage endures." The crowd stood clapping. Walter didn't stand, but his eyes traced the names etched into the bronze, wondering if Tommy's was there. The colonel's gaze found Walter, and he paused, stepping down from the stage. "Sir," he said, approaching Walter, "may I ask your name?" "Walter Hensley," Walter said, his voice steady now. 101st Airborne. Khe Sanh, 68. The colonel's eyes widened slightly, and he extended a hand. "Colonel James Hargrove. It's an honor, Mr. Hensley." He turned to the crowd, raising his voice. "This man fought at Khe Sanh, one of the hardest battles of the war. He's here today, and we owe him our thanks." The applause swelled louder now, and Walter felt it like a wave. He didn't look at the crowd, but at the plaque, at the flag, at the memory of Tommy's laugh. Kayla, behind him, wiped her eyes, and Jake sat straighter, his usual smirk gone. Carter saluted again, this time joined by the colonel, and for the first time in years, Walter returned it, his hand steady, his heart full. The ceremony ended, but the moment lingered. Walter stayed by the plaque, his notebook open to a new page. He wrote, "For Tommy, for all of us." The crowd dispersed, but a few lingered, shaking his hand, asking quiet questions. Kayla and Jake stayed too, listening as Walter shared a single story about a night under fire, when Tommy's joke about bad army coffee kept them sane. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the lawn, Walter felt lighter, like he'd set down a piece of that rucksack he'd carried for decades. The town would remember this day, and so would he. A small act, a salute, a photo, a name spoken aloud, had brought him back into the light. Who in your community carries a story waiting to be heard? Look closer. Subscribe to Hoffman's Stories for more tales of quiet heroism and the power of compassion.